A central global target, promised repeatedly at many levels, is to end hunger. It is the most immediate face of extreme poverty.
It's the most achievable goal. We know how to do it.
If there was a simple answer, there would be a simple solution, probably already implemented.
There is no need for anyone to sleep hungry, let alone die of hunger, when we are producing enough grain.
There's hunger and then there's hunger. We can solve this.
A central G20 2024 aim is to galvanize the support needed across sectors and regions to re-energize the effort and to speed progress towards the goal.
Religious communities are an integral part of solving most of the global challenges that we face today.
The interesting thing is that this is work that faith-based communities are already, in fact, implementing, but the work is not recognized as such, supporting and building their capacity and bringing the government involved with the religious communities in order to develop the policy aspect and make the work more effective is what's really galvanizes and pushes forward the impact.
If we each tackle our own individual issues in silos, without interdisciplinary partnerships, without interfaith partnerships, then we will plateau. We're competing.
Faith groups are on the ground level. But how does G20 leverage the common ground among diverse faith communities to amplify their impact? Through a top-down and bottom-up approach.
We're going to find that in the holy books, talking about feeding hunger. So it is there by default. So you need leaders to understand how we're going to package the message. We need to reach out to the local businesses to be able to change the mindset of the local community, that you have to find ways yourself to be part of that. Because unfortunately, for many years, our big donors, our donors everywhere, they are waiting for us to come up with programs and projects. I think this is the time for us to have some sort of round table with the local communities, asking them, what do you think of 1, 2, 3? How are we gonna be part of the fighting hunger? Empowering an idea started in America, and now I see it everywhere, traveling around the globe, which is the food banks. Food banks should be adopted by every single small city.
We had dramatic progress against hunger and poverty in the world over the last 3 decades. But then it's stalled. In some ways, it's gotten worse. President Lula grew up in poverty. He knows hunger firsthand. It's really important to him. He's been successful in Brazil in all 3 of his terms in reducing hunger and poverty. So now that he's president of the G20, president of next year's big environmental conference, he wanted some way to restart progress against hunger and poverty all over the world. And so he proposed this global alliance against hunger and poverty.
This aspect of the bottom-up approach aims to connect those seeking to help with local efforts that are already proving effective.
The idea is that it'll be a practical mechanism for working with governments and financial institutions, and where governments are willing to make commitments. Say they have a school feeding program that has really worked, or an agricultural development program that has really worked to reduce hunger and poverty. They can tell the Alliance, this is what we want to do. We want to make that big. We want to go nationwide with that, but we need financing, or we need knowledge about how other countries have done it. And the role of the Alliance will be to then go to sources of finance and say, you said you wanted to help, and here this country has got a successful thing going, they want to expand it, or they can go to knowledge institutions, universities, or other places that have concentrations of knowledge about agricultural programs and say, this is what they're doing, it seems to be working, what would you recommend to them? So they'll bring all those resources of money and experience to that country. I think the key to it all is that the Global Alliance is committed to getting progress going again. So it's not a talk shop. It's not debating a lot of things that are controversial that we don't know. It's starting with programs and policies that have been demonstrated they work, starting with governments that are already committed, show they're committed, and then recruiting the money and further information for them to succeed. The fact that we've had so much progress is a demonstration that we know a lot about how to reduce hunger and poverty. We know what works. And we can in fact get back on track toward the end of hunger, the virtual end of poverty. The main problem is wobbly political commitment. Governments and really the people of the world have other priorities now. So the faith community can play a role in building political commitment. That happens among people. As if people really want to see this happen, politicians will move.
This system of localized humanitarian efforts falters in isolation. The top-down aspect involves modifying government policies and shifting individual value systems to promote a culture of sharing.
It can be daunting when you hear and talk about ending poverty, but the reality is that we have enough to feed everybody. If we have the right policies on the ground, there have to be values that encourage people to share so that there's no hoarding. The values are to be added to the policy. And then I also believe that financing, putting money at the right places so that we're not spending a lot of money on arms, for example, and weaponry. But some of this money that is going into some of these things that don't really add very much value to people should be decentralized and rerouted to fighting poverty. Let me just add more, just from my own perspective and from the work that I do. There's also what we may call the poverty of mind and the poverty of the heart. And what I mean is people themselves, the right holders themselves need to empower themselves to see themselves fighting out of poverty so that it's not the charity, but it becomes a justice issue and social justice issue so that they know that it is their right to have zero hunger. It is their right to be able to eat and have 3 meals a day or whatever number of meals that you want and demand for it.
I think we live in a world right now where there's so much polarization on so many different issues. And I think people, instead of focusing on what we have in common, people tend to focus on the one thing that we don't have in common, or they draw these red lines around particular issues and aren't willing to be in relationship with people who on that issue have a different perspective. And I think the G20 Interfaith Forum brings together the diversity, like such a diverse geographic diversity, interfaith diversity, different political perspectives to really talk about shared goals for people on the planet. And I think when you bring people together and you're talking about children and the world's most vulnerable children, or you're talking about vulnerable communities and what we can all do to drive change and transformation for those people who are in the most need, I think you can find this common ground, and it actually serves as an example for so much of the rest of the world who, at least if you look on social media and things like that, it feels like everything is so polarized. And what we find in environments like this is actually there's so much common ground. We've been hearing all week about how zero hunger, people have said things like it's the most achievable goal, we know how to do it. Brazil has done it, and then they fell off the hunger food map. And now they're back on because of some challenges. In the sector, we'll see kind of what might even feel like competition for thinking about serving immediate humanitarian needs. We have famine and famine-like conditions now in an increasing number of places, often associated with conflict. Then we also have these longer-term systemic issues that impact nutrition and hunger for communities, all over the world.
Progress has been thrown into reverse by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, by climate change impacts, but especially by the proliferation of conflicts recently. And we know that so much of what was available for development budgeting has been diverted to military budgets now. So that has an obvious impact. But in addition, obviously, famine follows swiftly upon the heels of conflict. In places like Sudan, Gaza, and even worse than that, we see increasingly that access to food, or the denial of that access, is used as a weapon of war in many contexts now. And that's some sort of horrible reversion to medieval brutality, despite what we might think. It's actually, the majority of people are fed by small-scale food producers or by themselves as subsistence farmers. And therefore, that's where the focus has to be, on the small-scale producers, not on the corporates.
I'm sure there are food insecure people, here in Brasilia. I know there are in my community in the States. And so I think sometimes we get in unnecessary kind of fights about, should we feed the very hungry, or should we address these longer term issues? And instead of saying, okay, let's do both, we can get stuck there sometimes. Just general competition for funding and resources right now is another thing. So World Food Program is facing significant, I've heard as much as 50% decrease in their budget between this year and next. That provides most of the humanitarian food needs for people. And again, that all has to do with things like military spending or other types of priorities that governments have. So you can see kind of how the polarization is playing out. I think something that many faith traditions bring is both an abundance mindset instead of the scarcity and competitive mindset, as well as really innovative and proactive solutions that don't involve hundreds of millions of dollars going from here to here to here to ensure that the child on the corner who needs basic food or to sit down and look at the food systems in a more systematic and comprehensive way to understand what are the barriers to nutrition for an average family in the community.
I think it's a function of bringing the most affected people to the table. The people who know best what it is to be hungry, but also who know how that might be resolved within their local capacities and what they need in order to leverage that capacity for zero hunger.
It's really important to celebrate and acknowledge the work that faith communities in local spaces all over the world have been doing since the beginning of time. During COVID, we did a survey of faith partners, and after kind of the spiritual support, the top thing that faith leaders said that they were working on was food. Faith communities also own a lot of land and are thinking about sort of the land stewardship, food production in the context of their community. There's a lot of smallholder farmers in the context of local churches and other faith congregations. And there's a lot of influence in those spaces for how we use the land as individuals and as a collective that can drive towards more productive, efficient, and nutritious food for communities. One of the opportunities that G20 Interfaith presents is a third area, I think, where faith communities often are also involved, which is in social mobilization and policy advocacy. So trying to understand what are the evidence-based interventions that will work. The Brazil example has been used repeatedly, but they went in 20 years from a very food insecure context to essentially not having food insecurity. And so I think we can say, okay, here's this basket of policies. We've talked this week about the Global Alliance to End Hunger and the way that the government, the G20 governments, in particular the Brazilian government, is really leading on this policy basket. And I think it's a great opportunity for faith communities and the interfaith networks to come together to understand what is being proposed. And I think faith communities alongside governments can really play an important role across those three things.
I believe everything has to be contextualized. This is a global forum. We are coming from all parts of the world. And I don't think there's one solution to everything or one tool that will meet every need. So I've seen G20 decentralizing and evolving the meetings and the issues to regions, and I think that's a right step. I also believe that for what we discuss in a forum like this to have feet and hands and eyes, the language must also be devolved and contextualized. Sometimes we use high developmental language in forums like this, but if my grandmother, who is in the village, cannot articulate it and cannot understand it or speak it in her own language, then we've not succeeded. Faith communities are already doing some of the things that we talk about here, but they might not have the language we're using. So it's just to encourage them to keep on doing what they're doing, but also to give them the right skills and be able to connect them to the right actors that will lead to results that we're looking for.
I think it's really exciting, and I think in terms of the international institutions, it's the only game in town that is really committed to getting started again toward the end of hunger and poverty.
I think it's a work in progress. I think we're not there yet, but it's clear what the trajectory is and what our responsibility is. We have many top-level religious leaders or faith-based organization leaders here present in this gathering. I am not sure, with all due respect to them, that all of them are fully connected with the grassroots of their respective constituencies and are yet in a position to bring those people and those messages to the table. But that's the responsibility. What we have achieved, I think, is a good connection with the policymakers. We see that in the presence of Brazilian government representatives, Sherpas, members of the Sherpa team for the Brazilian G20 presidency. That's a sign of recognition of the salience, of the relevance of faith actors and faith communities in these policy processes. That's an achievement. But now we have to leverage that achievement and make it useful to the people who are at risk of being left behind.